I'm here with Phil Geldart, the CEO of Eagle's Flight, a corporate training company that specializes in cultural transformation. Hi, Phil. How are you?
Hey, Rabina. Great, thanks.
Thank you for joining me here today. We have a few questions about cultural change for you here today, because I feel like corporate culture is something that people talk so much about, but nobody really seems to understand how to actually affect real long-term change. So maybe for starters, you can just tell me a little bit about what are some of the big roadblocks that people seem to face when they're trying to make change within a company?
I think, Romina, the first thing you have to be aware of is culture isn't some abstract thing that sort of exists within a company. Culture is really the sum of the behaviors of the people. So if you have an organization, if you're leading a company, you have a culture, but the culture is really the way people act. And when you add up the way people act in every circumstance, that makes up your culture. So if you then say, I think we need to change it some way, you need to change the behaviors of the people. That's the critical question. Now, a culture transformation doesn't have to be the whole company. Sometimes the company is great in every area except maybe customer service. And they say, okay, we really need to just fix that particular area. So again, culture transformation doesn't have to be this thing that affects everybody and everything they do. It could just be an area needing attention. So to your question about the major roadblock, the biggest hurdle is getting people to be willing to change their behavior. So it's okay for an organization to come and say, we look like this, we want to look like that, and have pictures on the wall or posters, but it's getting people to be willing to change. And that, I think, is the biggest hurdle.
So based on that, when should a company get started?
So I think there's 2 or 3 things you need to think about. If I want to change any culture, and let's just take a micro culture. Let's say that you have a family unit, so you got a mom and dad, 2 kids, and a dog and a cat, and you want to change the way they respond to the grandmother, let's say. That's like a micro version of a culture transformation. So the parents have to demonstrate the behaviors towards the grandmother that they want the kids to demonstrate. They can't say to the kids, be nice to your grandmother, and the parents be mean to the grandmother. It's never going to work. The parents are going to have to model for the children. So similarly, in any organization, what the senior management does, what the leaders do, is the single most important thing to change that culture. They have to be models. They have to be examples. So that's the first thing that has to happen. And the second thing that has to happen is you then have to teach the people within the organization the new behaviors you want them to demonstrate. They don't just automatically know it. And often they look at senior people and go, wow, you guys are doing some great stuff, but how and why and what do you do? So firstly, you got to get senior people to model it. And secondly, you got to make sure that the folks that you are asking to behave differently know how to behave. So those are the kind of the 2 major things that you need to do. The third, because I kind of said there's 2 or 3, those 2 are the big ones.
Right.
The third is make sure you sustain the effort. You can't do it once and then it be done. You have to do it consistently. So it's a long-term thing. So to your question about when you should get started, I think the moment the company realizes the transformation needs to occur, they're tempted to get started. Let's go, we're ready to go. But they don't have the things in place. The senior managers themselves may not know how to behave. The senior managers themselves may go, okay, we don't know what the new behaviors are, so they're going to have to learn them. You have to put training in place. You have to put communication in place. So my recommendation is once you know you need to make the change, you need to do some backroom stuff first, and then you come and you bring it out to the company.
You were mentioning the importance of the CEO in leading the charge here, and
Yep.
how he or she has to model the behavior. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you get the CEO or the senior leadership involved in this, like how you actually get them to be the role model that they need to be?
That is a great question. I think, let me answer it a couple of ways. I think very often senior management has a clear picture of what must be, and typically in the world of a corporation, if you know what you want strategically, you have an army of people who help you execute that. So the initial task of a senior leader is to figure out what strategy should we adopt, kind of lay out a blueprint, be part of a strategic planning process, and then others go and implement it. So they tend to have the same mindset around culture transformation. Think, okay, we need a culture transformation. We look like this, we should look like that. So let's lay out a plan and then let them go implement. So the first hurdle is for senior management to realize it's not something you delegate. It's not something that you kind of pass on to have others do. A culture is the behavior of the people. So a senior leader has to demonstrate the new behaviors that you want. So then you then say, okay, why wouldn't they do that? I think the first thing is they probably don't know how important their role is. And I train a lot of senior folks, and I say, you don't realize you get up in the morning and you get dressed, and you look in the mirror and you go, okay, I'm me, and you go down and you have a cup of coffee, you put the dog out and you go to work. But you're you. You don't realize that when you walk into the company, you're like the senior leader. And people go, they're the senior leader, they've just come into the building. And you have a power and an authority in the organization that is often disproportionate to your own self-image. You don't think of yourself as this powerful person that everyone is watching. You just think, I'm just doing my job. So when we walk into the organization, we have to realize we put on this mantle of leadership. We take on an authority that is ours. It's legitimate. But you make decisions, and people's careers depend on what you say, and compensation and promotion. So you have a huge responsibility as a senior person. And that responsibility extends to demonstrating the new cultural behaviors. So it's not sufficient to know that the culture has to change. You then have to demonstrate it, which then says, so how do we do that? And in practice, you do the same thing with the senior folks that you do with everybody else. You put them into a training program and you say, okay, here's the way in which we would like you to behave. Now, clearly, if we're doing, let's say, a culture around engagement, employee engagement, and you're wanting people to speak up more, then you don't need to teach senior folks to speak up more. They're pretty good at that. They'll speak up quite willingly. Right. The junior folks need to be taught, how do I speak up? The senior people need to be taught, how do we encourage that? How do we listen? How do we demonstrate it? So you're not teaching the same content from the senior folks down to the rank and file, but you are teaching how the behaviors that you want in the new culture affect the senior people, the mid-management, and it will vary by level, but it's all about which behaviors do I have to demonstrate in order for the new culture to occur.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned the different levels within the organization, because I feel that we do talk a lot about the CEO and sort of put everything on that person. But if we sort of start taking it down a few steps, the line managers or HR, how involved do they need to be in this sort of transition?
That's a great question, because you're right. We do put a lot of emphasis on the senior people, but it's only because they have to get the ball rolling. Right. Once it's rolling, once they put it in place, and we know they're going to support it by their example, the emphasis shifts to line managers and the folks and HR. So the three groups you talked about. So the line manager has to encourage the new behaviors that we're asking the people to demonstrate. So if I train an employee on how to behave that's consistent with the new culture around innovation or customers or engagement, and my manager does not support it and encourage it, I'm going to stop doing it. So those two kind of run in parallel. Train me as the employee so that I know what you want me to do, but also train my manager on how to support me in the doing it. Now, of course, the manager's an employee, so they have a manager. So you're training every single person in the company on how to behave, but for folks that have leadership responsibility, you're also training them how to lead the right behavior. Does that make sense?
It does, yes.
So the HR function is a totally separate question. If you take a culture transformation and put it as the responsibility to make it happen on HR, it will not work, because it is not an HR initiative. It's a corporate initiative run by the strategic head of the company, which is the senior people. HR has a critical function in the back room to drive it. So they are the ones that should be designing the training, designing the communication, making sure the communication goes out, make sure the training is effective, making sure that all the pieces that you actually have to have in place happen. But they don't have the responsibility for the outcome. They have responsibility for the implementation.
Right. So it's a very different role.
Very different role. And a transformation will fail if you charge HR with making it happen. If you charge HR with implementing the strategy defined by management, then they'll be successful.
No, it makes sense. Obviously, different departments, different roles.
Exactly.
Okay, and then if we bring it down, I don't want to say bring it down, but if we're at the employee level in this case, from what I understand, these transformations can take a long time. It's something that can require a lot of effort. How do you keep people not only engaged in this transformation, but also excited about it so that they're giving you their best and that they're actively participating in it in a really productive way?
Yeah. Again, great question. It will typically start out with a big energy, a lot of enthusiasm. Oh, good, we're going to go from here to that's about time that they're going to make that change. I think the key issue is to recognize there are two forces at work. The first force is if you think of an hourglass and you flip the hourglass upside down, there's some sand that falls immediately to the bottom. There's some that kind of clings to the side and makes its way, and then there's some at the top that finally makes its way down. So the first thing is within any culture transformation, there will be some people who are going to get excited, they're going to jump on it, and they're the sand that goes down first, and they're always going to be first at every stage of the implementation. There are some that are going to take their time, and there's some that are going to be much longer coming down. So just human nature is such, some people will take longer than others, and you have to allow that. It just takes time for the sand to fall. However, the other thing is you have to sustain the momentum. If you don't sustain the momentum, it will get lost. So your next question is probably, how do you sustain the momentum? And I think there's a couple of things. There is a reason for the transformation. We're not just focusing on the customer because we have nothing else to do this week. There's some strategic reason, or we need to be more innovative. There's a reason for it. So initially, the reason the transformation starts with an enthusiasm and energy and a bang is because everybody goes, wow, yeah, we should do that. But that reason gets lost over time. It doesn't get repeated enough or it gets forgotten. So once you understand it's going to take people time, then you say, okay, so how do I sustain it? You have to keep the reason top of mind. There's got to be a line of sight between where we were and where we're going and why we're going there, and that has to be repeated over and over and over. So normally it takes 2 to 3 years to transform a culture. Right. So that's 3 years, that's 3 years of keeping that message alive, helping people understand why we're doing it, understanding why it's important. So if you think of a journey, we're here and we're going to here, constantly reminding people why we're trying to get here is key. The other thing is on the journey, you're going to be successful. So you need to plant a flag and say, hey, listen, we've taken some steps. That was great. Look at what we've achieved. Look at how the customer feels. So if you keep celebrating success, you maintain the energy. So number one, remember it's going to take time for everybody to get there. Number two, always remember to constantly repeat why we're going there. And then number three, celebrate success along the journey.
Right. No, and that sounds like it's a very important part of keeping people excited and on board, right?
Yeah.
Remember, keep that initial excitement, but also
Absolutely.
give people a pat in the back for all the work they've done.
And it leads to an interesting point that what I'm saying, people, well, that makes perfect sense. Yes, I get that. So then you say, well, why doesn't that happen? It doesn't happen because the people leading the transformation have maliciously hidden in a back room somewhere and said, well, we're now going to take the focus off. It's that other things have surfaced. If you think a transformation takes 2 to 3 years, in the life of a company, you could be making an acquisition, a divestiture, you could be building a plant, you could be expanding your sales force, you could launch a new product. There's all kinds of other new and exciting things happening during those 3 years. And they can easily overlay and mask something that was started 2 years ago and is now kind of underway. So you have to keep the focus on it despite all those other things that are coming in that could easily take the focus off the transformation. Right. That's why it's hard. Not because it's hard to keep the focus on it, but because there are other things that are trying to divert the focus away from it. So you have to intentionally stay focused.
Right. Well, and in the midst of all this, like you're saying, there's so much going on, there's a transformation, which may or may not be top of mind at different points. How do you measure the success that you're having with the transformation, and how do you sort of make sure that you're keeping track of that along the way?
It depends on what you're trying to transform to. So if, for example, you're trying to transform a company from one type of product to another type of product, the measure is going to be the success of that product in the marketplace. So sales would be a measure of your success because I'm transforming from being this kind of a product company to this kind. If, on the other hand, you're trying to improve your customer service, the measure is going to be what your customers say against you. If you're trying to transform into an innovation company or being more innovative, it's going to be the number of innovations that come forward and get launched. So depending on what it is you are transforming to, there are different kinds of measures. It becomes more difficult when you're trying to transform something that is more abstract. So if, for example, you're saying, I'd like to be a company where my people are more engaged or more committed to the outcome, there's no real measure there. It should show up in productivity measures, but it's hard to measure that. So then you have to look at things like employee surveys, culture surveys, things like that are a little more subjective. But I always say, okay, what are we trying to transform to, and what is the benefit to the company? So measure the benefit versus the transformation, because the transformation has to lead to a benefit. You're not transforming for the sake of transforming, but to benefit the company somehow. So the real measure of the transformation should be, are we getting the benefit we want? So measure the benefit, and that gets you to the...
And it goes back in a way, I guess, to this idea of being very clear about what you're trying to do.
Absolutely.
And keeping that top of mind.
Yep.
That makes sense. What would you say is the most essential component that is needed when you're trying to implement this sort of long-term change?
Well, I've talked about you got to have your leaders engaged. They've got to be model. Let me try to answer that differently.
Okay.
I think of three words that are necessary to change anything: model, coach, and require. So if you say to me, how do I do it? You could probably put it into those three words. The model word means I need to see examples of people living the new way. I need to see it from my peers. I need to see it from my boss. I needed to see it from my boss's boss. But we need people to demonstrate the behavior. So we are looking for models. So clearly senior management's got to model it. But if you're brilliant at it, then the organization should do a little article about, Romina's really good at this, and here's how she does it and why. So I say, okay, if what you want is what Romina's doing, then I get it. So I see a model. So that's the first one. Coach says, you got to help me. I'm never going to get it right the first time. When you try to transform a culture, people have a way of behaving now, and you want them to behave differently. Well, people don't just go, I know how to behave differently. You don't go from a not very good golfer to a brilliant golfer overnight. Right. You need help. You need coaching. You need teaching. You need training. You need reinforcement. So there is a process whereby you have to coach the person into the successful demonstration of the new behavior. So if I see examples, then I can copy. If I get training and helping and coaching, then I'm going to get there myself. And the third word is require. And that is, this is a non-negotiable issue. It's not a choice for an employee to decide, should I or should I not be part of this new culture? The organization says this is a strategic imperative. We've got to get there. Well, therefore, you need to buy in. Now, you as a human being may say, well, I really don't like where they're going. Then you should exit. Go find a company that you're comfortable with. Go find a culture you're happy to work in. But if you choose to stay, then you need to adapt to where the organization is going. So there has to be that discipline around require. And some folks say to me, okay, so if someone absolutely refuses to adopt to the new, what do? I'd say let them go. Do everything you can to get them there, but if they determine that they will not, then this isn't an option. You got to say, okay, then we're going to part company.
No, that makes sense.
So model, coach, require, I think would be the way to capture it.
Which makes sense. And perhaps this may be an opposite way of asking a similar question, but we're talking about what's essential. On the flip side, what are some of the biggest mistakes or the most common mistakes that you've seen companies or leaders do when they're trying to affect this change?
Yep. I think they try to impose it versus be examples of it. I think they do small pockets, so they may not involve the union, they may not involve regional areas, they may be a global company. So they want a culture transformation across, but we'll just do some groups, or maybe we'll pilot it. When you pilot it, what you really say is, well, we're not really serious about this. Now, you may pilot whether the training works, but you can't pilot the culture transformation. So they sometimes don't involve everybody. I think that's a big mistake. I think they present it often as a program. This is the new program. This is a new initiative. And a culture transformation isn't a thing. It's a way of behaving. So you have to go in and say, this isn't a program. This is going to be a flavor of the month. This is a DNA exchange. We're shifting. We look like that. Now we're going to look like this. And I think the test for that is a true culture transformation has occurred when the folks who initiated it, if they were to leave, the transformation would remain. So I'm not simply doing it because some senior people somewhere said we now have to behave this way. I'm doing it because I now have a personal conviction it's the best thing for the company. And whether the senior people are here or not, this is our culture and we will behave this way. So I think keeping it from being a program and making it more of a long-term thing are key. So I think engaging people fully, training them, equipping them, those are the things which you have to do, and organizations often don't do it. They sometimes think, well, we can get a transformation by telling people. But that's not transformation, that's just knowledge transfer. Right? So again, they make the mistake of not training properly, of not equipping people, of not giving time for that sand to flow down the hourglass. So those would be some of the key things I think stand in the way.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because it seems like there's so much involved in this, and there's so many places in which companies can go wrong if they don't have, I guess, the right coaching or the right direction. What would you say to companies who sort of want to give up about why it is so important to stick with the change once you've started it, even when it gets harder, when it gets long, or when you get lost a little bit along the way?
I think the answer to that question lies at the beginning of the journey. So if we work with an organization and talk about culture transformation, one of the things that we try to get them to understand up front is all the things that could derail it between now and the time that they actually see the impact. And how are they going to deal with that? If you launch off without thinking what could happen, when it happens, you have to deal with it and it could derail it. So for example, we're having a really good year. If next year we have a bad year and sales, we have a downturn in sales, but we're still planning to train the employees, are you going to keep up with the training? Training is an expense. Or are you going to put the training on hold because you're having a bad sales year? Well, let's have that discussion now. Because if I go to the company to say, you're going to be trained over the next 3 years how to demonstrate these new behaviors for the culture transformation, and then 12 months later, so by the way, the training is all stopped because we're having a bad sales year. People are going to go, okay, well then you weren't really serious about the transformation. Well, we know that's going to happen, so let's encounter that now. Because that means that either now I put aside the money for the 3 years, so I'm covered even if we do have a bad year, or I go to the organization saying, look, we are committed to this. Here are the 3 things that could derail it. And if these things happen, here's how we're going to respond. Don't misinterpret those as lack of commitment to the transformation. It's just the realities of the marketplace. We maybe can't afford everything. We maybe have to delay it a bit. But if we deal with those things up front, then the employees understand that we are committed for the long term. So the real answer to the question is not so much what could derail it and what will we do when we get there, as much as it is asking yourself, when we get there on this journey, how will we handle it? Let's make those decisions now so we don't get derailed.
And I guess, like you were mentioning, remembering that why you're doing it, the fact that this is important and that you have to stick with it, even in the face of potential adversity.
Exactly.
One last question I had for you, which perhaps is a fitting last question, but is there ever a point where that you get to when the transformation is complete and you're done? Or do you always have to kind of check in on
Well, there's 2 answers to that question. There's the answer everybody thinks and the answer which I think is probably the real answer. I think everybody thinks you are never done. That culture transformation is something which never ends. I don't think that's the real answer. I think that culture transformation does come to an end, but I'm going to put a little asterisk there in it. Because if you go back to what I said earlier, A transformation is the people behave one way and now they behave this way. Well, if you can get the folks of the organization behaving in the this way consistently, we're done. Because now they behave that way. So we are done.
Right.
The asterisk is you have turnover. You have new people. You have new situations. You have new things happening in the company. So I think you will need to do things to sustain the culture. But the transformation has occurred. But once it's occurred, I think you now need a different set of behaviors, a different set of things to sustain it, so that people know how to live the new culture as the world changes around them. So to that end, yes, you get there, you're done, we're transformed, but we can't just put it on the shelf and forget it. We now have to think, okay, how do we sustain it? Which is why I think people sometimes say, well, you're never done. But you are actually done, but now you have to shift your focus from a having done it to a sustaining it.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much, Phil.
You're
You've
welcome.
given us a lot to think about. I
All
appreciate
right.
your time.
Thanks, Romina.